This week I felt like doing something a bit different, so I did a drawing of an Eastern Kingbird and I enhanced the graphite with some watercolour. I've used graphite and watercolour together a few times before. I think the two mediums work beautifully together. I drew this koala in graphite and then I used watercolour on the leaves and the tree trunk. I also drew this little French bulldog and then I added some watercolour over the top of the graphite in places, and I painted the bright and funky watercolour shadow as well. I did a similar thing with this kingbird, but I mainly put the watercolour on the head and neck area, and there's no graphite under that area. I started by painting a wash on the background first. I let that dry and then I drew the bird over the top. When I got to the head and the neck area, I used watercolour there instead of graphite. One thing to watch when you put watercolour over the top of graphite, particularly if you've used soft, dark graphite pencils, such as a 4B, 5B or 6B, you'll probably disturb some of the graphite and it will move with the brush. It might dull or grey down your watercolour washes slightly, so be aware of that if you're using soft pencils. The graphite I used on this drawing was just ordinary graphite. It wasn't water soluble. I used a hard graphite to begin with and then I went over it in places with an HB graphite pencil. The paper I used was a piece of Arches hot pressed watercolour paper. This is the cute reference photo that I used for my drawing. It was taken by Pete Niche. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I downloaded it from Unsplash website. Pete has his own website where he has some beautiful photographs for sale, so check that out when you get a chance. I'll put a link in the description. As I said, this is Arches hot pressed watercolour paper. I'm using hot pressed instead of cold pressed paper because I prefer to draw on smooth paper. To get my drawing onto my watercolour paper, I drew the drawing onto a piece of paper and then I traced over it to clean it up. I rubbed some graphite over the back of the tracing paper and then I transferred it onto my watercolour paper. I could have drawn it straight onto my watercolour paper, but I didn't want to use my eraser on it too much in case I damaged the paper. What I want to do here is paint a splash of colour on the background. So I'm wetting the entire paper with some water, even over the top of the bird. This is cobalt blue. I'm painting flat on my table, but I'm going to lift my board now to make the paint flow down to the bottom of the paper. I'm holding it off the table now. Now I've got some Winsor Violet and I do the same thing. Just hold the board upright and let the paint flow down to the bottom. I take my brush and wipe away the excess paint that accumulates at the bottom. I let it sit for a little while until it started to dry, and then I got some water on my brush and I started to drop that onto the paint. That disturbs the pigment as it's drying and it creates those lovely organic shapes that help to add interest. Now the paper is dry and I'm ready to start working with some graphite. This is a Staedtler Mars Lumograph graphite pencil. It's a 3H that I'm going to use, so it's fairly hard. What I want to do is get some light coverage on top of the wings, and I'll come back later with a softer pencil that's going to be darker and I'll darken some areas. I'm using a distant grip on my pencil where I'm holding it loosely and I'm holding it away from the point. I make sure I don't grip the pencil too tightly too because I don't want my hand to get sore. Here I've got a paper stump and I'm using it to softly smudge the graphite. That softens any hard, sharp edges, and it puts a very soft layer of graphite on the white areas where I didn't draw. Then I started to do the same thing on the other wing. I'm using the same pencil and I'm drawing quite lightly with it. Here I'm leaving a little white gap between the feathers to give each feather a lighter edge. And I keep going on the wing feathers the same way, using the same pencil, holding it away from the point. Here I want to try and leave as much background paint showing through as I can. I don't want to cover up all that beautiful paint with graphite. And then I came back over the top with my paper stump and smudged everything. Because I used a hard graphite pencil, the graphite won't smudge or blend as easily as it would if I'd used a soft graphite, but it softened some of those hard edges for me. Moving down to the tail feathers, I'm using the same pencil here, using it quite lightly. On each feather I leave a little gap around the outside to create that lighter edge, and I draw each feather individually. Try and keep my strokes going in the same direction. These feathers are quite dark on the reference photo, but I don't want to go that dark just yet. Here on the edge I started to draw it in, and then I changed my mind and thought I might leave more of a broken edge there. So I got my eraser and removed some of it. On the head and neck I wanted to paint some watercolour. I want to work on wet paper, so I'm wetting it with water at the moment. I want to mix a grey. I'll use cobalt blue, that's the colour I used on the background. And I'll mix some burnt sienna with it. I'll put a bit of water into that so that it's not too thick and dark. And then I paint that onto the wet paper. The wet paper gives me those soft paint edges where the paint bleeds with the water. Here though, right on the edge of the bird, my paper is dry, right where my brush is now. Around here, the paper's wet and you can see how the paint bleeds with the water that's on the paper. I lightly dab my brush on the surface and that releases the paint, and then the water takes it. I'll take it down the side here too. Now I want a little bit of violet on my brush, that's Windsor Violet. And I'll drop that onto the grey area while it's still wet. This is called charging, where you drop one wet colour onto another. The colours blend together because there's water on the paper, and that creates some beautiful effects without even having to try. When you do that, don't try and mix the colours together with your brush. Just drop them in while the other colour's wet and let the water on the paper move them and blend them. I've re-wet the paper up here and I've got some more of that grey paint now. I see a hard edge where I don't want one, so I take the paint out of my brush and I quickly use my damp brush to soften away that paint edge. Then I keep going. I used a Pigma Micron waterproof pen on the eye. I think this is a number 4. I thought that would be easier than trying to use a brush on that tiny little spot. Then I got my graphite pencil again and I drew around the outside edge of the eye to create that rim that's there. When I put the paint on the head, I'll make sure I keep the paint away from that little rim. I wet the head with some water and now I've got cobalt blue, which is the blue I used on the background. I'm going to put some lamp black on this in a moment. I probably should mix my black, but I'm being lazy today, so I'm using lamp black. And while that paper's wet, I drop that on there. I paint it carefully around that little rim of graphite so that I can keep that showing and it'll be lighter than the black paint. And once I get away from that, I can put the paint on fairly quickly. This is a Da Vinci Maestro round brush and it's got a really fine point. It holds a lot of paint, but I can also do really fine, intricate work with it because of the point. Then I dab the paint on and as much as I can, I let the water move the pigment around. I push it a bit with my brush, but I try to let the water do as much of the work as I can. I'm just dotting it over the top of the blue. I want a little bit of the blue showing through. And I will have to come back and darken this black. I'll give it another layer. I dried the head off with my hairdryer and now I've got some more of the grey paint, which was the mixture of cobalt blue and burnt sienna. And I'll paint that up the back here. I only want to put the paint around the head. I don't really want to put it anywhere else, but I thought I'd take a bit of it onto the wings as well. Here I'm working on dry paper. Now I've got some black on my brush. It's quite dark between the wings, so I thought I'd put the black up there as well. Now I'll take the paint out of my brush and I'll use my brush to pull that paint over towards the other side. I've only got water on my brush now, it's slightly damp. That softens the edge slightly and takes the paint out further towards the edge of the wing. Here I'm starting to use the grey paint onto the wing itself over the top of the graphite. I wasn't sure how far to take this paint up the wing, so when I thought I'd taken it far enough, I stopped. My brush is damp with water now and I use it to soften the paint edge. And now I'm using the grey paint to add a little bit of detail, feather detail, under the neck. Softening the paint edge there. I don't want to fuss too much with it, but I thought I'd like a little bit of detail here. Now I'll take a bit of it over here underneath these feathers. This is still the grey that I mixed from cobalt blue and burnt sienna. Knowing when to stop is always the hard part. How much detail do you put? I painted in the beak with some of the cobalt blue. I dropped some violet onto that while it was wet, and I'll come back later and add some black to the beak. I thought I'd add some definition to this group of feathers here. So that's a bit of the grey paint mixed from cobalt blue and burnt sienna. I'll put some at the back of that feather too. So I've just painted around this feather here to bring it out. That's a bit of water on the side of the bird there, and then I'll get some of that grey paint again and paint that onto the wet paper to create an edge there. I decided not to take the paint all the way up to meet the top section because I wanted a lost edge just here. The beak was dry, so I could paint some black onto that. I'll leave a blue strip between the top and bottom beak. You can still see the blue showing between the two beaks, if I'm careful enough. I'll paint in the nostril while I'm here. This is on dry paper. I left that to dry and I painted a few extra feathers up on this wing. Still using that grey paint. Then I came back to the beak and painted in the top one. So I want to leave some of that blue underwash showing. I won't completely cover it with the black paint. Then I went back to my graphite work and I started to darken some areas. Here I've got my little Lamy mechanical pencil. I think this is HB and it's 0.7 millimeters, I think, from memory. This pencil is darker and softer than the pencil that I was using before. I'm drawing straight over the areas of graphite that I put on there before. I won't put this darker colour everywhere, I'll just put it in a few different places. I'm using this pencil because it's fairly fine and I can get into these little tiny nooks and crannies that I've got. There's no real method to my madness here. I'm going backwards and forwards between the graphite and the watercolour. I'm building up the colour and the value slowly, and I'm making changes as I work. So you can see I'm not putting the darker colour everywhere. I'm leaving some of that lighter graphite showing in places. After that, I came back down to the tail and I started to darken this group of feathers here at the bottom. This is a lovely soft pencil to use. It's only small, it's a clutch pencil, but it feels good in my hand. Because the graphite is quite fine, I can get into all the nooks and crannies. Here I've got a Tombow Mono Zero eraser pen. It's a tiny little eraser that you can buy refills for. You can see how fine it is. It's only a tiny little eraser. And it's handy because I can use it to get into these tight spots. I got a bit more black watercolour paint here. I'm painting over the top of the graphite in a few places. Then it was time to work on the branch. Using the graphite pencil again here. I thought I'd put the graphite on a bit darker here near the bird, and then as the branch moves away from the bird further out, I'll make the graphite a bit lighter in colour. That little eraser was handy here too. Because the painting is all cool colours, I thought I'd put a little dab of burnt sienna here and there. I've put a bit on the branch. Now I'm putting a touch of it on the bird, just to add a little bit of warmth. And then I went back to my head and I painted a bit more black. I needed to darken a few areas with the watercolour paint. I dabbed a bit of it through the lighter section as well. That's on wet paper there. So there's my watercolour enhanced graphite Eastern Kingbird finished. I enjoyed doing this little drawing so much that I decided to paint him in watercolour as well, without any graphite. This was a fun little painting that didn't take too long. I will make a full-length tutorial of this watercolour painting for Patreon as soon as I can, and I will probably include a copy of my graphite study so that patrons can have a play with this one as well if they want to. Thanks for watching. I hope I inspired you to try enhancing graphite pencil drawings with watercolour. Please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next week. So drew this little Frenchie, and then I added some watercolour. Watercolour. Started by painting a wash on the background first. I let that dry and then I drew the bird over the top. Yeah, like this. When I got to the head and the neck, I used watercolour there instead of graphite. A 4B, 5B or 6B, you will probably disturb some of the graphite. Yeah, this stuff. Graphite. With a brush, it might dull the watercolour down or it might grey it somewhat. Somewhat. One thing to watch when you put watercolour over the top of graphite, particularly if you've used soft, dark graphite pencils. Graphite pencils.